We live in a world built by giants. Every day, we trust our lives to the invisible mathematics that hold up our bridges, the steel veins that support our skyscrapers, and the concrete walls that hold back the ocean. We walk through life assuming the engineers were right. We assume the calculations were double-checked. But history is a graveyard of arrogance. Sometimes, the difference between life and death is a single rusty bolt. Sometimes, it is a decimal point moved 1 inch to the left. And sometimes, it is simple human greed. When these massive systems fail, they don't just break, they scream. In this feature-length documentary, we are going deep into the archives. We will reconstruct the 10 most terrifying engineering disasters in modern history. These are the moments when humanity fought the laws of physics, and lost. Louisiana, 1980. Lake Peigneur was not just a body of water, it was a paradise. On the weekends, families would swim in its shallow, warm waters. It was calm. It was safe. Or so they thought. On the morning of November 20th, a team from Texaco was drilling for oil in the middle of the lake. The foreman, a man named Jimmy, had a bad feeling. The drill bit was stuck. It was grinding against something hard. He thought it was just rock. He didn't know he was knocking on the door of a catastrophe. 1,300 feet below the mud, 55 miners were working the morning shift in the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine. It was a city underground, with miles of tunnels and massive caverns. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A low rumble echoed through the salt walls. Then, the sound changed to a deafening roar, like a jet engine starting up inside a closet. The mine supervisor saw something impossible: water. It wasn't dripping, it was spraying horizontally, cutting through the salt like a laser. He slammed his hand on the alarm. The lights flashed 3 times. This was the signal every miner feared. Evacuate now. Back on the surface, the nightmare was just beginning. A fisherman named Leon Spirom watched in horror as the massive, 150-foot oil rig began to tilt. It groaned, twisted, and then vanished silently into the brown water. The lake began to spin. A vortex formed, initially small, but growing exponentially. It was hungry. It swallowed the drilling platform. Then a second platform. Then the dock. Imagine the physics involved here. As the water rushed into the mine, it compressed the air trapped below. This air had to go somewhere. It exploded out of the mine shafts, shooting 400-foot geysers of mud and debris into the sky. It was a scene from the apocalypse. Miraculously, the miners below managed to cram into the slow-moving elevator. As they ascended, the water was chasing them, snapping at their heels. They made it to the surface just seconds before the entire mine shaft flooded. For 2 days, the lake was a chaotic blender. It reversed the flow of the Delcombe Canal, creating a temporary waterfall that dragged 11 barges into the abyss. When the sun finally rose on the 3rd day, the freshwater lake was gone. It was replaced by a deep, saltwater bay. The ecosystem was erased. And all because a surveyor on the surface forgot to account for the curvature of the coordinates. A simple math error that moved the Earth. Boston, 1919. The North End was a bustling neighborhood of Italian immigrants. In the center of their lives stood a monster, a steel tank, 50 feet tall, filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The tank was a ticking time bomb. The Purity Distilling Company knew prohibition was coming, the law that would ban alcohol. So, they overfilled the tank to the brim, trying to produce as much rum as possible before the ban. The tank was groaning under the pressure. Children would run up to it with cups to collect the syrup leaking from the rusty rivets. The owners knew it leaked. Their solution? They painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. January 15th was strangely warm. The temperature rose sharply. Inside the tank, the molasses began to ferment, producing gas. The pressure built up. At 12:40 p.m., the rivets gave up. They shot out like bullets, sounding like a machine gun battle. The steel sides of the tank peeled open. A wave of molasses, 25 feet high, crashed into the streets. This wasn't a slow spill. It moved at 35 miles per hour. It hit the local firehouse. The building was lifted off its foundation and smashed. It hit the elevated train tracks, snapping the steel girders like matchsticks. But the true horror was the stickiness. When a person is hit by water, they can swim. When you are hit by a wall of syrup, you are trapped. Survivors described the noise. A terrible sucking sound as people tried to pull their limbs out of the goo. Horses were the most tragic victims. They were glued to the street, thrashing in panic until they died of exhaustion. Rescuers arrived, but they became stuck too. It took hours to cut the victims out of their hardened, syrupy tombs. 21 people died. Most suffocated, their mouths and noses filled with molasses. The court case that followed was historic. It revealed that the man in charge, Arthur Gell, couldn't even read a blueprint. He had never tested the steel. To this day, old residents of Boston claim that on hot summer days, the streets of the North End still smell faintly of sweet caramel and death. April 25, 1986. Pripyat, Ukraine. The night was calm. Inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the control room of Reactor 4 was tense. A group of young engineers, led by Anatoly Dyatlov, were conducting a safety test. But they were tired. They were under pressure to finish the test before the May Day holiday. They made a series of mistakes. They disabled the automatic shutdown systems. They pulled out too many control rods. The reactor became unstable. It was like a car engine revving at maximum speed with no oil. At 1:23 a.m., Akimov, the shift leader, realized something was wrong. The power levels were surging. He shouted, "Shut down. Press AZ-5. AZ-5 was the emergency defense. The kill switch. A young engineer pressed the button. They expected the reactor to stop. Instead, they heard two loud thuds. The floor shook. They didn't know it yet, but they had just detonated the core. The flaw was hidden in the design of the control rods. The rods were made of boron, which stops the reaction. But the tips, the parts that enter the core first, were made of graphite. Graphite accelerates the reaction. For a split second, the graphite tips spiked the power to catastrophic levels. The water in the core flashed into steam instantly. The 2,000-ton concrete lid of the reactor, coined Elena, was blown into the night sky. Glowing pieces of radioactive graphite, hotter than the surface of the sun, rained down on the roof. The firefighters who arrived first didn't know what they were looking at. They saw chunks of black mineral on the ground and kicked them aside. They were kicking pure death. The radiation was so intense it ionized the air, creating a beautiful, terrifying blue beam of light shooting into the sky. Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. It was the result of a system that valued secrecy and cheap materials over human life. That button, AZ-5, was supposed to save them. Instead, it was the trigger of a gun pointed at the world. November 7, 1940. Washington State. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was a beauty. It was the third longest suspension bridge in the world. But it had a nickname, Galloping Gertie. Drivers would cross it just for the thrill. On windy days, the car would rise and fall like a boat on the ocean. The designer, Leon Moiseev, wanted the bridge to be elegant. He removed the heavy trusses that let the wind pass through. He used solid steel plates. He thought he was building a bridge. Physics decided he built a kite. On that morning, the wind was blowing at 40 miles per hour. Not a storm, just a steady breeze. But it hit the bridge at exactly the wrong angle. The bridge began to twist. Leonard Coatsworth was driving his car across. The road tilted 45 degrees to the left, then 45 degrees to the right. His car slammed against the curb. He opened the door and crawled on his hands and knees. The concrete was cracking beneath him. He could hear the steel cables screaming, a high-pitched shriek of metal being stretched beyond its limit. He looked back. His dog, a cocker spaniel named Tubby, was still in the back seat. Leonard tried to go back, but the bridge bucked violently, throwing him down. A photographer famously ran out to save the dog, but the terrified animal bit him. He had to retreat. At 11 a.m., the suspension cables snapped like whips. The massive center section of the bridge fell 200 feet into the freezing water below. Tubby the dog was the only casualty. But the footage of that twisting bridge is shown in every engineering class on Earth. It taught us about resonance. The same force that can shatter a wine glass with a human voice can destroy 1,000,000 tons of steel. Kansas City, 1981. The Hyatt Regency was the jewel of the city. The lobby was an open atrium, filled with plants and light. Suspended from the ceiling were 3 skywalks, floating concrete bridges. It was Friday night. A tea dance was underway. The band was playing jazz. 1,600 people were in the lobby, drinking, dancing, and laughing. Dozens of people were standing on the skywalks, watching the crowd below. At 7:05 p.m., a loud crack echoed through the room. It sounded like a gunshot. People looked up. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the 4th floor skywalk detached from the ceiling. It fell straight down, crashing onto the 2nd floor skywalk. The combined weight of 2 concrete bridges, and hundreds of people, slammed onto the crowded dance floor. Silence fell for a moment. Then, the screaming started. The scene was gruesome. The water pipes had burst, flooding the lobby. Electrical wires were sparking in the water. Forklift drivers from a nearby construction site rushed in. They tried to lift the concrete slabs, but they were too heavy. Survivors were trapped in the rubble for hours. Surgeons had to perform amputations right there in the muddy water to free people. 114 people died that night. The investigation revealed a sickening truth. The original design was safe. But during construction, the steel fabricator asked to change the design of the supporting rods to make them easier to install. It was a simple request: can we use 2 short rods instead of 1 long one? The engineers approved it over the phone. They didn't recheck the math. That tiny change doubled the load on the nuts. The nut holding the bridge was essentially trying to hold up 2 elephants with a shoelace. It remains the deadliest accidental structural collapse in American history. A tragedy caused by a phone call. Italy, 1963. The Vajont Dam. It was the tallest dam in the world. A masterpiece of Italian engineering. But nature was sending warnings. The mountain next to the dam, Monte Toc, was unstable. Farmers reported that their cows were nervous. Trees on the mountain were moving. The ground was creeping. The engineers ignored the farmers. They said, "The concrete is strong. Even if the mountain slides, the dam will hold." They were right about the dam. But they were wrong about the water. At 10:39 p.m. on October 9th, a massive slab of the mountain broke off. It was 2 kilometers long. It fell into the reservoir at 110 kilometers per hour. The impact was so violent it registered as an earthquake in Vienna. The water had nowhere to go. It rose up in a single, terrifying wave. The wave was 250 meters high. It blocked out the moon. It flew over the top of the dam. Below the dam lay the sleepy town of Longarone. The people were in bed. They heard a roar like thunder, but there was no rain. The air pressure wave hit them first. It was so powerful it blew the clothes off their bodies and flattened stone houses instantly. Then came the water. In 10 minutes, the town of Longarone ceased to exist. 2,000 people were wiped off the face of the earth. The next morning, the sun rose over a desolate valley of mud. But the dam was still standing. Perfectly intact. A cruel tombstone overlooking the destruction it caused. January 28, 1986. Florida. The Space Shuttle Challenger was sitting on the pad. It was covered in icicles. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees overnight. At the headquarters of Morton Thiokol, the engineers were panicking. They knew the rubber O-rings that sealed the rocket boosters would freeze and fail. Bob Ebling, one of the engineers, told his wife the night before, "It's going to blow up." They called NASA. They begged. They argued for hours, "Do not launch." But NASA was under pressure. The program was delayed. The White House was watching. The managers famously said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch?" Next April. They overruled the engineers. At 11:38 a.m., the engines ignited. The crowd cheered. For 73 seconds, everything looked perfect. But on the side of the right booster, a tiny puff of black smoke appeared. The O-ring had failed. A jet of hot gas, burning at 5,000 degrees, leaked out. It acted like a blowtorch, cutting into the massive fuel tank filled with liquid hydrogen. At 46,000 feet, the tank gave way. The explosion was silent at first. A massive cloud of smoke. Then, 2 trails of smoke branching out. The crowd on the ground stopped cheering. They waited for the shuttle to fly out of the smoke. It never did. 7 heroes died because a room full of managers thought they knew more about physics than the engineers who built the machine. New York City, 1978. The Citigroup Center. This skyscraper is famous for its slanted roof and the fact that it stands on stilts. The engineer, William Lemessurier, was hailed as a genius. But one day, a student called him. She asked, "Why did you put the stilts in the middle of the walls, not the corners?" Lemessurier explained his logic. But then he decided to check his math again. His blood ran cold. He realized he had calculated the wind hitting the flat face of the building. But he forgot to calculate quartering winds hitting the corners diagonally. He checked the blueprints. The builders had bolted the joints instead of welding them to save money. The math was clear: a storm with 70 miles per hour winds would snap the bolts. The 59-story tower would topple into Midtown Manhattan. Tens of thousands would die. Hurricane Ella was forming in the Atlantic. It was heading straight for New York. Lemessurier had a choice: silence or suicide. He chose the truth. He went to the board. They hatched a desperate plan. They hired a team of welders. But they couldn't let the public know. It would cause mass panic. So, every night at 8 p.m., an army of welders entered the building. They worked until 4 a.m., welding massive steel plates over the weak bolts. The Red Cross secretly estimated how many thousands of body bags they would need. The police had a secret evacuation order ready. Lemessurier sat by the radio, sweating, listening to the weather report. Luckily, the hurricane turned out to sea. The welders finished the job. The secret was kept for nearly 20 years. It is the only time in history a disaster was averted because one man had the courage to say, "I was wrong." April 20th, 2010. The Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon was a floating city. It was drilling the deepest oil well in history, 35,000 feet down. The crew was celebrating. They had just finished the job and were preparing to leave. But the well was kicking. Gas was pushing up the pipe. The engineers ran a negative pressure test. It failed. The pressure was too high. But the managers on the rig were tired. They wanted to go home. They came up with a complicated theory to explain away the bad data. They called it the bladder effect. They convinced themselves everything was fine. At 9:45 p.m., a bubble of methane gas shot up the riser pipe. It expanded as it rose, turning into a supersonic cannon. It hit the engine room. A spark ignited it. The explosion was visible from 40 miles away. Survivors described the heat as intense enough to melt the paint on the lifeboats. 11 men were vaporized instantly. But the disaster wasn't just the fire. The safety device on the ocean floor, the blowout preventer, failed to cut the pipe. For 87 days, black oil gushed into the pristine waters of the Gulf. Pelicans covered in oil. Beaches turned black. The economy of the coast destroyed. It was the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. All because a manager looked at a warning sign and decided to ignore it. We end in Seoul, South Korea. 1995, the Sampung department store. It was a pink, luxury palace. 40,000 people shopped there every day. But the building was crying for help. Originally designed as an office, the owner changed it to a mall. He removed vital support columns to make room for escalators. But the killer was on the roof. 3 massive air conditioning units, weighing 45 tons, were dragged across the roof. This created deep cracks in the concrete. For 2 years, the AC units vibrated. Buzz. 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 Every vibration widened the cracks. The building was slowly unzipping itself. On the morning of June 29th, the cracks were so big you could put a fist through them. The managers held an emergency meeting. The engineers said, "Evacuate the building. It will collapse." The owner refused. He didn't want to lose the day's revenue. He even left the building himself to save his own life, but left the customers inside. At 5:52 p.m., the roof gave way. The columns punched through the floors like a hot knife through butter. In 20 seconds, the 5-story building pancaked into the basement. 502 people died. Waitresses, shoppers, children. They were crushed under the weight of greed. The owner was found guilty of criminal negligence. But it was too late. It stands as the ultimate reminder: you can bribe inspectors, you can ignore engineers, but you cannot bribe gravity. We have traveled from the depths of the earth to the freezing sky. We have seen bridges dance and dams hold back tsunamis. Each of these 10 stories shares a common thread. It wasn't the steel that failed first. It was the human factor. Arrogance. Complacency. Greed. The laws of physics are written in stone. They do not care about our deadlines or our budgets. If we respect them, they allow us to touch the clouds. If we ignore them, they bring us crashing down. Thank you for watching this journey. This documentary took hundreds of hours to research. If you believe in the importance of these stories, please subscribe and share this video. Stay curious. Stay safe. And remember to always check the math.